In April 2023, he was found severely dehydrated and barely conscious near a remote river in South America. This is his account. I'd never trusted the river. Even before I saw what it could do, there was something in the way it moved. Slow on the surface, almost lazy. But beneath that calm lay a force that didn't care about anything in its path. I'd come here to fish. That was all. A last-minute trip after too many weeks behind a desk. I told myself I needed quiet, something to scrape the noise out of my head. But the river had other ideas. I remember the way the water looked that morning, slick and brown, flecked with leaves drifting from the jungle canopy overhead. Birds flashed between the branches, and the air was already thick with heat, though dawn had only just broken. I'd set up camp on a high ground near a bend in the current. My small boat was tied to a crooked root, bobbing in the eddy like it was eager to slip away the second I stopped watching. I thought I'd been careful. I thought I understood the risks. But it only took a moment. One careless step on the wet slope as I reached for the rope. My foot skidded. My balance vanished, and then I was sliding down the bank, arms pinwheeling, the world a blur of green and brown. The river caught me like it had been waiting. Cold shock punched the air out of my lungs. I went under once, twice, the current spinning me so fast I didn't know which way was up. When I surfaced, I managed a ragged gasp before the water closed over my head again. I clawed for anything, roots, rocks, the slippery bank, but the current pulled me deeper, faster. Some distant part of me registered that the boat was gone. My pack, the radio, everything I'd brought with me, all swept away in an instant. The river didn't care. It just carried me. I don't know how long I fought. Long enough that my limbs went numb, my lungs burned, and my thoughts grew thin and tethered. Then, just as suddenly as it had taken me, the current spat me into a wide, shallow eddy. I hit bottom hard enough to drive the breath from my chest. My hands sank into cold mud. I lay there, heaving, feeling the water drain away around me. When I finally pushed myself up, the jungle loomed in a wall of tangled green. I staggered to my knees, coughing river water. My mouth tasted of silt and something metallic I couldn't name. The bank here was lower, a slope of slick clay leading up into dense undergrowth. I looked back over my shoulder. The river had already reclaimed the stretch I'd crossed, smooth and indifferent as ever. Whatever I'd lost was gone for good. I knew I had to get out of the water before the cold finished what the current had started. I dragged myself onto the bank, every movement an effort. My clothes clung heavy to my skin. My arms and legs were scraped raw from hidden rocks. For a long moment, I knelt in the mud, trying to catch my breath. Birds called overhead, bright and sudden, as if nothing had changed. I pressed my palm to the center of my chest, feeling my heart stutter and pound. I was alive, but I was alone, and I had no idea where the river had brought me. I turned to study the jungle. Between two massive trees, a narrow path wound deeper into the green. I didn't know who or what had made it, but if I wanted any chance of finding help, I had to start somewhere. I wiped the mud from my hands and stood, every muscle trembling. Then I took my first step into the trees, trying not to look back, because the river wasn't done with me. I could feel that truth in my bones. The path looked like nothing more than an animal trail, no wider than my shoulders, the ground churned to mud by countless small feet. But it was the only break in the wall of vines and low branches. I picked my way forward, each step sinking into the soft earth. Leaves brushed against my arms, shedding cold droplets onto my already soaked clothes. The air changed as I moved deeper. It grew thicker somehow, humid and close, laced with the green, almost sweet smell of rotting vegetation. Insects clung to my skin.
I battered them away, but more came, drawn by the salt of sweat and the sluggish heat. I tried to keep track of where I'd come from. Every few yards I turned to look back, fixing the angles of trees in my memory. But it all looked the same. Massive trunks bound in strangler vines, a ceiling of leaves so dense it turned daylight into a mossy gloom. 10 minutes in, I'd already lost any sense of direction. My heartbeat quickened. I stopped, closing my eyes, and forced myself to count to 10. Panic wouldn't help. One step at a time. When I opened my eyes again, I noticed something I'd missed before. A length of frayed cord wrapped around a branch at shoulder height. Weathered, faded to a dirty tan. I moved closer and touched it. It snapped under my fingers. Old, maybe years. I looked around, searching for any other sign. Nothing, but it was proof, however small, that someone else had come this way. I kept walking, scanning the undergrowth for more clues. The path began to climb. My calves burned with the effort, every muscle still weakened from the river's pull. At the top of the rise, the jungle thinned enough that light fell in broken shafts across the ground. I stopped and tilted my head back, trying to gauge how far the canopy stretched. Somewhere behind me, a branch snapped. I turned so fast I almost lost my balance. Nothing moved, but the silence that followed felt deliberate, like something holding its breath, waiting to see what I'd do next. I swallowed against the dryness in my throat. The river had taken my canteen, my food, everything. I needed water before night came. I began to follow the ridgeline, hoping it would lead me to a stream, or at least a depression where rainwater had pooled. Each step grew harder. My mouth felt like it was packed with cotton. My head buzzed with a dull, insistent ache. The jungle closed in again, branches brushing my shoulders. Then, just ahead, I saw a clearing, small, no bigger than the footprint of my old boat. At the center lay a blackened circle of stones, a fire ring. I stumbled forward, dropping to my knees beside it. Charcoal fragments still littered the inside. When I brushed them with my fingers, they crumbled to powder. Someone had camped here. Maybe not recently, but long enough to prove that survival wasn't impossible. I searched the perimeter, hoping for more. Some forgotten scrap of gear, a container, anything. Nothing. I sat back on my heels and closed my eyes, breathing slow and shallow. A soft rustle came from the trees behind me. When I turned, I saw it, a long track winding across the damp soil. Wide, smooth, a snake's passage pressed deep enough to catch the light. I felt my heart lurch. The jungle was alive in ways I was only beginning to understand, and I was no more prepared for it than I had been for the river. I wiped my sweat from my forehead and forced myself to stand. I couldn't stay here. If night came while I sat in this clearing, I knew exactly how it would end. I took one last look at the fire ring, proof that someone else had fought to survive, and turned back toward the trees. I had to keep moving, even if I had no idea which way led out. I didn't know how long I walked after leaving the clearing. Time had turned into something shapeless. A long stretch of heat and exhaustion that wrapped around my thoughts like a bandage I couldn't peel away. The track the snake left behind seemed to follow me. Or maybe I was just imagining it, seeing the same smooth depression over and over because my brain couldn't process anything else. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter. Snake or no snake, the only thing that would kill me faster than fear was standing still. Somewhere overhead, a bird let out a low, throaty call. I paused to listen, wondering whether it meant water was near. I could feel my pulse in my tongue. Every swallow scraped dry against the roof of my mouth. I kept moving, placing each foot with care. Roots snagged at my boots, vines draped across my shoulders. Every few yards, I stopped to rest one hand against a tree trunk and steady my breathing. The jungle felt closer here, so thick that even when I lifted my head, I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. I began to think about the last time I'd been this thirsty. A camping trip as a teenager, lost on the mountain overnight with nothing but a cheap flashlight. Back then, it had felt like an adventure. Now it felt like a rehearsal for something I'd never really understood. I forced the memory away and focused on the ground ahead. That's when I saw it. Another length of frayed cord, this time knotted tight around the base of a sapling. I crouched to touch it. The fibers were newer than the last one, still rough under my fingers instead of crumbling to dust. A trail marker. Someone had been here recently enough that the jungle hadn't had time to reclaim everything. I straightened, heart knocking in my chest. If they'd marked the way, maybe there was a path to follow, maybe even shelter. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the undergrowth. Nothing else stood out at first, but when I looked closer, I saw a faint break in the foliage, a place where broad leaves had been pushed aside, leaving a narrow passage deeper into the trees. I hesitated. Every instinct told me that following it might lead me into more danger, but staying here wasn't an option. I slipped between the leaves, ducking low to avoid the hanging vines. The path twisted through dense growth, angling down into a shallow gully. The air grew cooler, darker, and then I heard it. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy gliding over wet leaves. I stopped, every muscle locking tight.
The noise came again, closer this time, steady and deliberate. My mind painted the shape before my eyes could confirm it, the broad, pale body of the snake winding its way down the same narrow path. I turned my head, searching for an escape, but the gully sides were steep, the soil sleek with moss. There was nowhere to climb. I backed away, heart pounding so hard it made my vision pulse. The dragging stopped. Silence bloomed, heavy and absolute. I held my breath, willing my body not to betray me with some involuntary movement. A single leaf shifted at the bend ahead. Then another. I caught the glint of scales in a shaft of weak light. It was larger than I'd thought. Longer than I was tall, broad enough that the undergrowth parted around it like water. I knew if I ran, it would follow. So I stood very still, trying to remember every training I'd ever read. Don't provoke, don't turn your back, just wait. The snake slid forward another foot, tongue flicking out to taste the air. I felt something inside me slip, a tightness in my chest I hadn't even known I was holding. This was its territory. I was just passing through. Slowly, carefully, I began to edge sideways, one step at a time. The snake watched me, but it didn't follow. When I reached the slope at the gully's far end, I climbed without looking back. Each handhold felt slick, unreliable, but somehow I made it to the top. Only then did I turn. The snake was still there, coiled in the shadows, watching. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and plunged into the trees, moving faster than I knew I could. I didn't stop moving for a long time. Branches whipped across my arms and face, leaving shallow cuts that stung in the heat. My legs ached with every step, but fear lent me a kind of hollow energy, enough to keep going when any sane part of me would have collapsed. When I finally slowed, I braced one hand against a tree and tried to catch my breath. The jungle was quieter here. Or maybe it only felt that way because my heart was still thundering in my ears. I wiped sweat from my eyes and looked around, scanning for any sign of the snake. Nothing. Just the endless green, so dense it felt like a living wall pressing in on all sides.
I swallowed, but my throat had gone too dry to ease. I needed water more than I'd ever needed anything. I tilted my head back, searching the canopy for signs of rain. A break in the leaves, any suggestion that a storm might be coming to save me from myself.
But the sky was a flat, bright glare, broken only by the shifting silhouettes of birds I couldn't name. I turned slowly, trying to decide which direction held the best chance of survival. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, an interruption in the natural order of trunks and vines. I took a step closer, then another. Structure. Half hidden behind a curtain of broad leaves, its edges softened by moss and years of neglect. I pushed through the undergrowth and stopped. A small hut, maybe no larger than a garden shed, stood in a shallow depression where the ground had settled. Its walls were lashed together from bamboo and palm fronds. The roof had partially collapsed under the weight of fallen branches, but it was human-made, proof that I wasn't the first to be trapped here. I felt a surge of hope so sudden it made my vision blur. I crossed the clearing in a few stumbling strides and laid my hand on the wall. It held. I circled to the doorway, little more than a rectangular gap framed by two poles. Inside, dim light slanted across the dirt floor. I saw the remains of a sleeping mat woven from palm strips, a few rusted cans scattered in the corner, evidence of another life, another struggle against the same indifferent jungle. I stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop a few degrees as the shadows swallowed me. I crouched to inspect the cans. Labels faded to nothing, edges sharp with corrosion. I didn't risk opening them. Botulism was as deadly as any snake. But tucked behind them, half buried in dry leaves, was something better. A plastic jug, opaque white, scuffed and dented. I lifted it with both hands, feeling the faint slosh inside. Water. I twisted the cap with shaking fingers and sniffed. No sourness, no oily sheen. I took the smallest sip. It tasted flat, but clean. Relief hit me like a physical force. I forced myself to drink slowly, savoring each swallow. When I'd had enough to steady the worst of the dizziness, I sank back against the wall. The hut felt like a sanctuary, however temporary. I knew it wouldn't protect me forever, but for the first time since the river had taken me, I believed I might have a chance. I set the jug beside me and leaned my head back, letting my eyes close for just a moment. Outside, the jungle kept its own counsel. I heard insects ticking in the leaves, the distant calls of birds. I almost convinced myself I was alone again. Almost. Because when I opened my eyes, I saw it. Pressed into the dirt just beyond the doorway. A long, smooth track, the width of my forearm, winding around the hut and vanishing into the trees. I felt the cold certainty settle into my chest. The snake had been here too, and it hadn't gone far. As the sun dipped below the canopy, the temperature began to fall. The relief of cooler air was short-lived. With darkness came a new kind of fear, a quieter, more insidious dread that crept under my skin and made every shallow breath feel dangerous. I knew the snake was still nearby. I could feel its presence as surely as I felt the dull ache in my bones. When the last scraps of daylight vanished, the hut became a black box. No fire, no lantern, only the faint, luminous band of stars behind the slats in the roof. I sat with my back against the wall, the jug of water at my side, my knife resting across my knees. I told myself the dawn wasn't so far away. All I had to do was endure the hours between. But each minute stretched out longer than the last. The jungle outside never fell fully silent. Insects ticked and hissed in the leaves. Somewhere deeper among the trees, something let out a low, throaty cough. And every so often, I heard it again. that slow, deliberate sliding over earth and fallen leaves, the sound of muscle and instinct moving without hurry because it had all the time in the world. My hand tightened around the knife hilt. I tried to breathe evenly, tried to pretend I wasn't waiting for that pale shape to appear in the doorway. Hours passed. At some point, the fatigue became heavier than fear. My eyes drifted shut despite everything. I don't know how long I slept, only that when I woke, the sound was closer. So close, I could feel the faint vibration through the dirt floor. I swallowed, my mouth too dry to make any sound. The moon had risen high enough to throw silver bars across the hut's walls. In that dim glow, I saw the smooth curve of its body gliding past the open doorway. It didn't enter. It paused, tongue flicking, tasting the air. I forced myself to stay perfectly still. The snake lingered there, as if considering whether it was worth the effort. Then, slowly, it began to circle the hut. I could hear the leaves shifting, the soft drag of its belly over the ground. Every instinct screamed at me to do something, make noise, rush out, run anywhere. But I knew better. Movement would only provoke it. So I stayed frozen, heart hammering in my chest. The snake completed its circle and paused again in front of the doorway. A long moment passed. Then it turned and slipped into the darkness, its body vanishing between the trees with no more sound than a whisper. I exhaled, feeling my whole body shudder. I pressed my palm to the floor to steady myself. It was gone, for now, but the knowledge brought no comfort. I was a trespasser here, an interruption in the slow, patient life of this jungle. And the snake was a reminder of how thin the line between survival and failure could be. When dawn came, it found me sitting exactly as I had all night, knife across my lap, back pressed to the wall, eyes fixed on the doorway. I didn't trust the daylight any more than I trusted the dark, but I knew I couldn't stay here another night. Sooner or later, the snake would decide that curiosity wasn't enough. And when that happened, no walls, no matter how carefully built, would save me. I stood, every muscle aching with fatigue. Today, I would find a way out, where the jungle would finish what the river had started. I stepped out of the hut with the first pale wash of dawn. The air was cool enough to make me shiver. But as the sun crept higher, heat would return, bringing all the old dangers back with it: dehydration, disorientation, the silent glide of the snake in the shadows. I knew this was my last chance to find help before I became too weak to try. I took a careful sip from the water jug, just enough to wet my throat, then screwed the cap tight and slung it over my shoulder with a length of vine. I paused in the clearing, listening. Nothing moved. I turned away from the hut, forcing my legs to carry me uphill. My plan, if it could be called a plan, was simple. Climb high enough to see the river or coastline, anything I could use to orient myself. Each step felt heavier than the one before. My body ached with the accumulated weight of fear and exhaustion, but I kept moving, up the slope, weaving between trees so massive it felt like walking through the ribs of some ancient animal. Once, I stopped to press my palm against the rough bark, just to feel something solid under my hand. Above, the canopy thinned. Bright shafts of sunlight speared through, painting the undergrowth in blinding white. I reached the top of the ridge just as the heat began to gather in the still air. When I pushed through the last tangle of vines, I nearly collapsed. Below me, the jungle fell away in a long slope toward the river. The same river that had tried to drown me, now glinting, innocent, and bright in the morning light. Beyond its far bank, I saw a thin line of sand, beach, and something more. A structure, angular, metal, flashing in the sun. My breath caught in my chest. A building. No bigger than a shed, but undeniably man-made. Possibly a ranger station or a supply depot for surveyors? I let out a sound, half laugh, half sob. Relief surged so bright it left me dizzy. I had a destination now, something I could reach. I started down the ridge, moving with a caution born of too many close calls. It took longer than I expected. The slope was steeper than it looked, the soil loose under my boots. More than once I had to grab at roots to keep from sliding into the undergrowth. But hour by hour, the river drew closer. By midday, I stood at its bank again. The current still moved fast, but not as viciously as before. I scanned the water, searching for signs of the snake, but the surface was clear, just the mirrored sky and drifting leaves. I picked my spot carefully, a narrow stretch where fallen trees slowed the flow. I tightened the vine around my shoulder and waded in, teeth gritted against the cold. The water rose to my waist, then my chest. Each step was a battle against the current, but the promise of that building kept me moving. When I finally staggered onto the far bank, my legs almost folded under me, but I was across. I took a moment to breathe. Then I climbed the last low rise and found the building waiting. Corrugated metal walls, a faded sign bolted to the door, words too weathered to read. I knocked anyway, more from habit than hope. No answer. I tried the latch. It lifted. Inside was a single room, bare floor, a cot, a rusted cabinet. But in the corner, an orange case marked with a black cross. A radio. My hands trembled as I unlatched the lid. When I pressed the power switch, a thin whine rose from the speaker. I keyed the mic, voice cracking. This is a survivor. I need help." For a moment, nothing. Then a burst of static and a reply. "Copy that. Hold your position. Help is coming." I sank to the floor, clutching the mic. Outside, the river moved on, uncaring. The snake was somewhere in the jungle, coiled and waiting. But it didn't matter anymore. I was going home.